So welcome everyone, and hope you've had a good week. You know all that stuff. You know who we are. Do follow us on social media. Some of you have been in touch. We have sent out a couple of things. So the recordings of the videos are now beginning to add on to all of the school's pages of our website. They're all there, and I've sent letters out to the schools to send out to everyone across the school population to remind everyone of passwords. If you need a reminder and you want to circumvent waiting for the letter, just email me about that, and I'll give you that information. And I have sent out separately an email to all of everyone who signed up to give you access to the video ahead of the school sending it out. So loads of you have replied. I don't send the video as a link. I send an email saying, hello, do you want the video? And then I send it as a link. Then your spam filter is unlikely to kind of kick it out. That's the plan anyway. So whenever we do webinars, those of you that are here for kind of the second set of webinars who were with us in sort of March, April, May last year, will know we do a bit of a recap. The reason we do a recap is you can't talk about brain science without using brain science. So brains remember dangerous information, stuff that's interesting to us, and repeat information. So we need to make sure, hopefully, this falls into category 2. It's interesting, but we remember repeat information. So it's important to repeat it. If we don't repeat the information, our brains will delete it. They work on the basis that whatever you use your brain for, it encodes that and keeps it. Whatever you don't use your brain for, if you don't think about it, if you don't focus on it, if you don't attend to it, it will delete it. And that is exactly the same for schoolwork as well. So you might be sitting in a lesson thinking, yeah, I've understood this. If you don't go over it that night, the next night, it will be gone within a few days because our brain's designed to forget information. So in proper Netflix tradition, previously on Building a Neuro Ninja in Learning and Life, a quick catch up. We talked about the REACT system being the get you ready for action system, the sympathetic nervous system, and how that impacted on how we feel. We then talked about the response system, the other side of the nervous system, the calming down system, and how both those systems affect the kind of mind that we get to live inside. The 21st century is full of this stuff, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and that upsets our brain. Certainly old circuits in our brain get upset by that incoming uncertainty, and that leads us to be pitched into our react system much more. So we end up feeling kind of stressed, overwhelmed, closed in, overthinking, and actually we need to take a step back, and that's where those rocks of well-being come in. So we looked last week and we asked you to think about where you are currently and where you've been during the day and the week. Where are you? Where do you want to be? How do you get there? So where are you in the transition zone? Are you kind of anxious? Are you calm? And actually, we've got this automatic system, parasympathetic, sympathetic, that comes on automatically, but we can turn it on by our activity. A bit of yoga will turn on our parasympathetic nervous system. Breathing exercises do the same. A good old chin wag with a mate chewing the fat will do exactly the same. And that is important to understand because the way we feel is projected by our brain. And if something occurs that causes our brain to automatically start up the react system, that changes the kind of mind we're living inside. If something awful happens, we don't feel great, not just then, but for quite a while as we recover, as we come back out of that system. And equally, if something great happens, that affects the kind of mind we're living inside, because the body and the brain, like we talked about last week, project the mind like a projector projects an image. So we asked you to think about being aware of where you are in your head. Notice, you know, you're feeling closed in. Are you feeling dry mouthed? Are you in your sympathetic nervous system? And we are spending a lot of our time in that space simply because of the intensity of the time that we're living through. That's where the rocks come in. 9 of these turn on the calming down system. And then we talked about the mental kind of toolbox where you build in a bunch of calming down routines that you could take around with you. So a picture of a pet, a restful scene you could call to mind, some calming down music, where you can get yourself in a space where you're turning on your parasympathetic nervous system and calming yourself down. And we ended last week, and this is where we're going to start this week, talking about the fact that if we don't plan our day, our brain, because it's quite energetically lazy, because it likes to save lots of energy, it will choose passive and easy. That's why we're stuck on our phones. That's why we're stuck on Netflix. That's why Netflix reloads immediately into the next one, and you can skip the intro because it wants to keep you there, because it knows your brain loves passive and easy. In fact, I remember reading something about Netflix executives saying their main competitor was not Now TV or BBC iPlayer. It was, in fact, sleep. So they've designed it that way. So you're building the rocks in. Which ones are you going to build in first? How are you going to fit them in your day? And there's lots of examples on our website of how you can do that. And if you follow us on social media, we like to publish loads of stuff. And if you've got a particularly natty way of getting your rocks done, let us know. We need to live in a balanced nervous system. The first step is to work out where we are in our nervous system and then achieve a bit of balance. Remember, the mission is to help you understand your brain and become a neuro ninja. Waking up in your head, waking up in your brain, understanding how it works. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. It is the best kit you will ever own. It is unbelievable what it can do and respond flexibly. And we want to help everyone make every day a masterpiece, changing our mind about our brain, and then changing our brain, and then changing our world. Okay, so today we're going to focus on why don't I get stuff done and how can I be more productive. And it's a particular issue when we're working from home, learning from home, and we'll look at why that is, and we'll look at what we can do about it. So first of all, I think we need to define our terms, and we need to think about procrastination. So hopefully we're going to see a video here with Harry Enfield's Kevin, the teenager. I spoke to a teenager about Kevin, the teenager, a little while ago, and they didn't know who he was because it's been off TV for a while. But let's just get this idea of procrastination. Every brain is a procrastinating brain. And what we see here is Kevin being fantastically procrastinating, if that be a word.
10!
I beg your pardon?
£10!
Don't be silly, Kevin. £5 we agreed, and £5 it is.
That is so unfair!
Take it or leave it.
All right!
Now, all the stuff you need is over there.
Mum and I are going for a walk. We'll be about half an hour, so you'll have done the car by then, won't you? Won't you?
Okay!
Oh, look. He hasn't even started it.
Oh, God. Kevin, what are you doing?
All right! I know! God, for God's sake!
How's he getting on?
Well, I don't think he's started yet. He's sitting by the car having a look.
He's not there.
Oh, no. Has he gone to the shops or something?
Kevin!
The car!
Where's it's not too bad, is it?
Good, really. Kevin.
Obviously, our kids are not that much of a procrastinator, but our brain is a procrastinating brain. It will try and save energy. It will try and conserve effort. And that means that whenever we sit down to do something that's demanding, I mean, let's face it, you know, we talk about our children and we might say our children have a problem with motivation, but yet they might play, you know, a computer game for 5 or 6 hours with their mates if we let them. So there's not a problem with motivation. There's a problem with motivation for things that you have to do rather than things that you want to do. And it's distinguishing between those two different sorts of motivation. So this isn't an excuse, any young people listening to this, but procrastination is a more exaggerated issue for young people. They can end up in a much more dithery space because their prefrontal cortex at the front of their heads is less mature. Now, we talked last week, there is no boss circuit in the brain. There's no place that directs everything we do. But if there is a place that aims our brain at a particular target or a goal, the prefrontal cortex is the bit that does that. And in teenagers, that area is still growing. In fact, the brain matures from the back to the front. So the prefrontal cortex is not mature fully until we're 25. But that isn't an excuse because there's lots of things that we can do, ways that we can structure our day that get the most out of our productivity. So brains are procrastinators for 2 reasons. First of all, thinking is hard and brains trying to avoid expending the energy. And the second reason that there's procrastination is because when we're learning new things, that's like doubly hard. The brain's trying to make connections across new synapses, building synapses, reaching out, growing new dendrites. So the best way to think about our brain is a complex natural system like the weather or the ocean. Our brain and mind is really complex and it is very sensitive to changes in daily habits. So you might have heard of the butterfly effect, that idea that a butterfly could flap its wings in South America and there'd be a hurricane in Florida 10 days later, a tiny change in the atmosphere. A tiny change in our habits, for good or ill, can take our brain in a different direction. And because it's so sensitive to initial conditions, it could be a tiny change like we've seen in society over the last year, massive changes. You know, we're not hanging out with people as much, you know, we're not going into work as much, we're not going into school as much. All of these things have a massive impact on the kind of brain we're living in and the mind that we're living in. The brain is very, so I'll give you an example. Think about teachers going into school. They're no longer going into school, a lot of them, they're teaching remotely from home. They're no longer going into the staff room, having a cup of tea, chewing the fat with their colleagues, sorting out a few problems at break time. They're missing out on that bit of socialization. And if we think we've all got spaces in our lives where that happened naturally, where it doesn't happen as much now, that is going to have an impact on the kind of mind that we're getting to live inside. So let's think about how the brain responds to the world. What happens when the brain responds to the world is an event happens, and it happens first in our sensory and our emotional system. We talked about the emotional system last week, and activation moves out, up, and across the brain. Think of the brain like a pond. An event occurs, makes a splash, and then ripples move out across the brain, affecting the whole brain. Remember, there is no boss circuit. So the whole brain is going to get affected by that event. We're going to have emotions about that event. We're going to think about that event. We may be planning to respond to that event. And it's best, as we saw last week, to give ourselves plenty of time to let that event spread across the brain. So we're giving the best response. And that comes from circuits up here in our solution focused prefrontal cortex, which is incredibly important because our brain is like a noisy parliament. It's like a rowdy parliament. It's like a noisy hall. Just looking at that picture with all those people close together, you're thinking, where are their masks? They're not socially distancing. Obviously, this is a photo from before that time. But imagine and recall that your brain is basically a team of rivals, a rowdy parliament of circuits that evolved to do different things at different times. That is how it's possible for us to have an argument with ourselves. Literally, some circuits take one view, another group of circuits take another view. So how can we get our brain to do stuff every day? We need to understand there's a bit of the brain, like John Burko, the ex-Speaker of the House, that calls the brain to order and says, oi, we're going to do this now. We're going to do this. Shut up, guys. We're doing this now. Now, that takes quite a lot of effort for that bit of the brain. And that bit of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. That is the bit that calls us to order. Now, circuits in there, neurons in there are very sensitive to fatigue. They're very sensitive to stress. As we saw last week, when we're stressed, our prefrontal cortex is underpowered. So we are most effective at directing our brain's effort through our prefrontal cortex, motivating ourselves, avoiding procrastination, and getting stuff done when we're in our response system. If we're not in our response system, we have more problems. This explains why we find it much harder to get things done when our PFC, our prefrontal cortex, is underpowered. So what causes it to be underpowered? When we're tired, that's when our diets fail in the evening, isn't it? When we're stressed, because blood's draining from the prefrontal cortex. When we're feeling overwhelmed, again, stress. When we're in pain, if we're carrying emotional pain in the middle of our brain, that'll affect the prefrontal cortexes that call the brain to order. When someone we care about is in pain or we're worried about them, when we're carrying lots of emotional pain ourselves, all of those things affect our ability to be productive. The ability of the prefrontal cortex to basically say, oi, we're doing this now. So how can we get stuff done? Well, first of all, we need to look after our PFC. We need to make sure that we give this area of the brain what it needs to be able to call the rest of the brain, all those circuits that are shouting at each other all the time. We need to support those circuits to be able to call the brain to order. So we need to get good sleep, because that supports the prefrontal cortex. It cleans it of fatigue. We need to exercise often, because that raises blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, increases connections because of the a release of a hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We need to do chores and have two tasks often, because that means that we're getting dopamine up into our prefrontal cortex. It takes time to move. Dopamine is the reward-seeking chemical. So we need to do a few chores for other people, and we need to have routines, and we need to make plans. If we don't make a plan, we're watching Netflix. If we don't make a plan, we're scrolling through our phone. So how does making a plan or having a deadline help the PFC? It creates the chance for the brain to be called to order. And effectively, the PFC is saying, guys, be quiet. We're doing this now. And, that works for 15, 20, 25 minutes. Then distractions come in. And how annoying distractions are, because basically what's happening is your PFC is being ripped away from controlling the rest of the brain. And all these kind of circuits are starting shouting at each other. You've just got them quiet. So it's really important when we're focused not to have lots of distractions around. And that's why the 21st century is so tricky, because you get your phone over there, you've got 17 tabs open, you're doing 19 different things at once. And the PFC takes a lot of effort just to get the brain quiet. And if you've got lots of distractions, those circuits can get involved. Let's talk about moaning briefly, because it's linked to this process. So all of our brains, and it's not just me, I'm sure, all of our brains tend to moan a lot to themselves about the problems you've got to solve. It's this, it's that. Now, remember, we're in a negatively biased mind. We're going to have more negative thoughts than positive ones, because those kind of thoughts kept our ancestors alive. Focusing on the problems in the world meant you could avoid them. The brain's main job is to spot those problems and solve them and or avoid them. So in our emotional brain, level with our ears, we've got problem spotting circuits, and they get alerted first to any uncertainty in the world, and they pass that message on. They kind of talk to the prefrontal cortex, and we looked at some of that stuff last week. So what happens when we're moaning is our brain's problem solving circuits have spotted a problem, and they are communicating that to the rest of the brain. But there are loads of circuits in our brain, and a lot of them have got nothing to do with solving problems. They're running different systems in the brain, but they've all got a view on the problem. And usually it's a view that's flipping out. Really? Do I have to? So the trouble is about 10% of moaning is productive. The rest is brain circuits that have got no kind of offer in terms of solution, taking a view and offering an opinion when it isn't helpful. So it can be exhausting, moaning, and it takes away focus from our prefrontal cortex because we get distracted by all those circuits. It's just those circuits pitching in when they haven't actually got anything to offer. We can't stop moaning completely, but we can ask ourselves 4 quick questions to get to the nub of the issue. What is the problem that is hiding underneath the moan? Get to the nub of the problem. Is it actually a problem or is it just a whinge? Do I have information and resources to solve that problem? Do I need someone's help to solve it? And if I've got everything I need, what, when, and how am I going to solve it? All of that stuff is possible in our prefrontal cortex. That's what it's there for. It's there to think, right, okay, we need to do this now, we need to do this now. It's there to call the brain to order and to sequence activities. So let's talk about habits and routines, because this is key to getting stuff done. So how do habits and routines help our motivation? Repeat behaviors at the same time each day in the same situation mean that slowly but surely, over time, over days and weeks, the PFC hands over the duty of starting that habit to a much older automatic part of the brain. So, you know, if you wanted to set up a study habit, you rock up at 5 o'clock every night and you review your day's learning, or you wanted to set up an exercise habit, you rock up at 8 o'clock and do a bit of Joe Wicks in the morning. Do that repeatedly, do that repeatedly, do that repeatedly, turn it into a cue, the time, the routine, the activity, and the reward, feeling good because I've done my exercise, feeling like I've learned a bunch of stuff because I've done my study slot. And then basically what happens is the PFC, if you give it that opportunity, the deep in the brain, deep in the emotional brain, is a very old bit of the brain that basically does habitual behaviors. So it will do good behaviors, it will do bad behaviors. It's very, very linked to the reward system as well and the dopamine system. So there's a bit of a double edge to this, but let's just talk about it for now. You're doing your habits at the same time every day, and the PFC can give the job of starting that routine to an area of the brain called the dorsal striatum, deep in the brain. And that's how habits work. If you build the habits in, build the habits in, build the habits in, they get more automatic because the dorsal striatum is told by the PFC, we're doing this habitually, take this off me, take this off me. So if the routine or habit has a cue, a routine and a reward, we can get the dorsal striatum to help us. So having a set time to do a habit or a set place where you do that habit triggers that habit. The problem we've got with the dorsal striatum is that it is dumb. It doesn't do a great deal of thinking. It just repeats behaviors. And if those behaviors involve kind of, you know, nicotine, for example, or alcohol or drugs of addiction, the dorsal striatum is very wedded to the dopamine system and can be disrupted enormously by massive changes in drugs that affect the dopamine system. And it's the site, the dorsal striatum, of compulsion and obsessive behaviors as well. So as long as we give it good habits, it's a support, but it will also enact bad habits as well. So we just need to be aware of that. Okay, so we are literally thinking about changing our brain by changing our mind about it. And it is through this habitual process, making ourselves aware, like you are on this webinar, of what you need to do, booking a time and giving your brain time, 5, 6, 7 weeks of repeat activity to build it in and get the dorsal striatum involved in supporting that habitual behavior, taking the effort away a bit from your prefrontal cortex so it gets a bit more bandwidth and it can do some other stuff. So how can you do all this? Well, you need to plan your day. Now, I know you get loads of remote learning and stuff, but as much as possible, you need to protect your prefrontal cortex and you need to divide your day into different sorts of activity. So I'm going to suggest 5 different sorts of activity on the basis of the effort required of the PFC. So hard activities, schoolwork, work, deliberate practice, like for a musical instrument, writing, maths, hard, cognitively demanding activities, do them as early in the day as possible, because to hold our focus and process that work is a lot of effort for the prefrontal cortex. It can do it, but we need to do those things early. If we put them off, it's much less likely we're going to do them later in the day. Then there's interesting activities, which are much more engaging for the brain, still take some effort from the prefrontal cortex, but much more interesting. So these are life affirming activities, reading, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts, but not as demanding on the prefrontal cortex. Fun, leave it till later, because you'll never forget to do fun. And it doesn't involve, it's full of want to motivation. You haven't got, you don't have to force yourself to hang out with your mates online and play a game. Chores are really good, like I mentioned, because they get us into that have to motivation. They get dopamine in the right place. And the rocks, drop them in throughout the day to reset your focus. When you turn your parasympathetic nervous system on, your prefrontal cortex wakes up. And you can use these different activities to move you into the green zone through the day. So you can do fun to get you in the green zone. You can do a cognitively demanding activity to get you into the green zone. And we should think of our PFC as a resource that we manage through the day. So if we're flagging, if our attention's flagging, get up and move about, have a walk, manage your productivity throughout the whole day. And remember, if you don't plan every day, your brain will do passive and easy. And it's the prefrontal cortex that will call it to order and get stuff done. So a deadline is great for the prefrontal cortex because it says, guys, we need to get this done by then. And a goal is equally important for a prefrontal cortex, and challenges are good for the prefrontal cortex. It loves challenge because it's about achieving something in a set time, or it's about decoding a particular problem. So we need to look after that bit of our brain, make sure we're getting enough sleep. That's why you find it much harder to concentrate when you haven't had enough sleep. That's maybe why you're finding it hard to concentrate right now, because you're so stressed because of the pandemic. And that will have a huge impact on your level of concentration and focus, because stress differentially affects the prefrontal cortex over and above any other part of your brain. And the last thing I wanted to say about routines is it's really important to build those routines in because it supports the dorsal striatum. But there are other circuits in your brain that get bored. And it's really important to build a day that moves stuff around. So you have 2 parts routine. So you're following a set of routines, but you have a bit of novelty in there. You do different things on different days because novelty is really refreshing for the brain. So 2 parts routine, 1 part novelty. The routine helps your prefrontal cortex and your dorsal striatum. Your novelty wakes up your prefrontal cortex and gets you a kind of bit more awake during the course of the day as you're kind of moving through the day. So we've reached the end of this week's session. We'll get together again next week at the same time. This video will be available shortly. It gets processed at the weekend. My son edits it and it'll be on the website. If you want it earlier, then the school will send you a letter for it. I can send you the link. Thank you so much. Don't forget, look after your prefrontal cortex, manage your motivation every day. Take care, everyone. We'll see all of you next week. It's lovely to be with all of you again.